Langston Hughes was born on February 1st, 1902. He was born with the name James Mercer Langston Hughes, but this was later changed. Shortly after his birth, Hughes' parents split up. His father moved to Mexico, and his mother moved from place to place. This called for his grandmother to be his primary guardian during his youth. As a dishwasher in a restaurant in Washington, D.C., Hughes met American poet Vachel Lindsay and showed him some of his poems. Lindsay liked them so much he promoted Hughes' poems and they became more popular. A few years later, Hughes received a scholarship to attend Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. He met American novelist and critic Carl Van Vechten while attending the university, who later helped Hughes get a book of his poems published, which later had popular appeal and established who he was as a poet, as well as his commitment to black themes and heritage. Another piece of work that Hughes contributed to was his comic strip of a man named Simple that was used to explore urban working-class black themes, as well as addressing racial issues. This strip was published with the Chicago Defender, a weekly Chicago newspaper intended for the eyes of African-American citizens of Chicago. On May 22, 1967, Langston Hughes died from complications of prostate cancer. Hughes's accolades consist of the Harmon Gold Medal for Literature in 1930, the NAACP Spingarn Medal in 1960, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Awards in 1961.
Langston Hughes grew up in a period of major changes among the black community. Living through and being directly involved in the Harlem Renaissance, Hughes contributed greatly to the atmosphere of redefining African American identity. His writing, and the writings of many others like him at the time, helped to protest stereotypes and racism. Shortly after, Hughes lived through the Great Depression, an era of American history in which African Americans faced many economic hardships and economic survival became their number one priority. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal allowed for an increase of opportunities for blacks, although somewhat stifled by the white supremacists in the South. The emergence of the Communist Party as an institution for African Americans was also important to the development of black independence in the U.S. Lastly, Hughes lived through the era of World War II, in which blacks began to become more involved in ordeals on a national scale and was present for the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. Hughes, living through a period of drastic changes for African American rights, was heavily influenced by events such as the Harlem Renaissance, the Great Depression and its aftermath, as well as the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement.
Langston Hughes' poem, I Too, is representative of the racially segregated world that surrounded him and the American dream of equality that so many held throughout the 1900s. Hughes sets the scene of this poem in the kitchen to portray the image of a house party where everyone is free to roam, at least until the company comes. Hughes defines himself as the darker brother, to show that although everyone is connected in the sense of family, he is defined and separated by the color of his skin. He says that they send me to eat in the kitchen, in the second stanza, to portray the racial divisions that his race has encountered. Then, Hughes makes a shift to the hopeful nature of the American dream in the third stanza when he talks about his dream for tomorrow. Using the same metaphor as before, Hughes portrays the wishful desire for equality that the African American race has longed for throughout history by comparing it to the wish that the speaker has to be included in the dinner with the company.
Hughes's poem, Negro, is a definitive representation of the development of African American identity throughout history leading up to the present, praising the boldness and independence of African American character. In this praising of the African American legacy, Hughes uses this poem to recall and reflect on the injustices that his race has endured throughout the years and project the image of a more hopeful and equal future. One way he goes about this is through the use of personal pronouns such as I and me to generalize and unify the African American race as a whole. In using this language, Hughes reflects on the types of stereotypes people have towards others at first glance. By using himself as a symbol to embody all the hardships of his kind, Hughes makes the point that everyone is connected in this century-long struggle for equality, and the trials of their ancestors are no different than the ones that are undergoing. Hughes builds on this generalization of the African American race in the second and third stanzas when he uses a submissive tone with complementing diction such as made me and told me, to write about the subordination of his race during slavery. By including prominent figures such as Caesar and Washington, Hughes hints at the subtle greatness of his race in playing such a crucial role in the building of the monuments that immortalize these great figures. Hughes continues through the history of his race by implementing a sad tone into the fourth stanza when he describes the journey from Africa to Georgia, alluding to the period of slavery in America. Hughes then uses the term sorrow songs to symbolize the sorrowful yet rich culture that his race refused to give up after they had been stripped of all materialistic representations of it in their homeland during the trip to America. In the fifth stanza, Hughes shifts the tone of his poem to that of violence when he writes of the brutality of the Belgians cutting off his hands in the Congo and the fact that they lynch me still in Mississippi. Hughes includes this violent portion to connect the injustices of the past to the present injustices of segregation and the harsh racism of his time. Hughes also uses repetition as a crucial part of his message. For instance, Hughes uses the repetition of switching from past to present in the second and third lines of the fourth middle stanzas in an attempt to reveal the continental and chronological contrasts alongside the cultural and behavioral similarities. His repeating of the phrase, "I've been," unifies the middle portion of the poem, during which he generalizes his own race's history. His final form of the repetition is the contrast of each of the beginning lines as he switches from the past tense of "I've been" to the present tense of "I am" to show the separation from the cruelties of his past to the current hopeful longing for a future where he can be what he chooses to be. After the American World War II victory, Langston Hughes questions if those who deserve liberties and recognition are extended to African Americans. His poem, Will V-Day Be Me Day Too?, labels African American soldiers as deserving members of society who put themselves at risk in order to preserve their country. Yet it's not for certain that an American victory would mean an African American victory, especially at a time of social injustice and discrimination. Hughes makes a good point in stating that the old Jim Crow hold me back, saying that even though America won the war, civil disparities between races in America will continue to divide them, even though they had worked together during the war effort. Blacks have fought just as hard as whites and sacrificed their lives for a country they loved, but did this country love this person back? By signing the poem as G.I. Joe, it shows that this was the view of the typical American soldier who came back from the war. They did not go through intense fighting to come back disrespected by their own society. This is comparable to the treatment that soldiers suffered after the Vietnam War, in which all soldiers, regardless of race, were treated with disrespect and ignorance. African American soldiers had fought for the preservation of American democracy against opposing enemies during World War II. However, back home, they still received racist and discriminatory treatment from a significant portion of the population, including from extremists like the KKK. Hughes questions the legitimacy of the American democratic system, since other racial groups like the Italians and Chinese are also being misrepresented. It is extremely disappointing to Hughes and the African American community that even black soldiers were second class to whites, even though they had fought as effectively. This poem sets the guidelines for racial disparities between whites and blacks even during war times. Hughes uses all three poems to critique the racism that was so prevalent in his life in years prior. He not only connects the past to the present by writing about violent and sad times for his race and history, but he also takes a more current perspective on the issue of segregation when he points out the hypocrisy of allowing certain people to die for a country but not fully live in it. Hughes focuses on these issues of racism and the ever-present American dream of false promises for the future as a way to call for a social change in society, or at least a step towards a more equal America for all races. It is this goal that gives Langston Hughes' poems such a profound effect on readers.